Venezuela's economy collapse. The Venezuelan central bank has done something completely unexpected, and it publishes current economic figures showing that the country has plunged into its biggest economic crisis of the year. It would be surprising to hear a few Venezuelans not to be disappointed, but the new figures released by the Venezuelan central bank on January 15 still seem like a punch to the intestines. Annual inflation is 141.5% in 2015, twice the rate of 2014, and the worst in the world. High inflation in Venezuela is not unusual. However, since 1999, Chavez's mode has done relatively reasonable work to keep inflation below the level of crisis. However, the new figures show that the gross domestic product has declined by 7.1% until the third quarter of 2015. Growth is not everything, especially in an economy that seeks to move away from capitalism. Nevertheless, these numbers are excessive. Moreover, the devil has details. The Central Bank of Venezuela (BCV) stated the food costs are the biggest cause of inflation in the distribution of industry. Consumers in Venezuela increased food prices by 55.7% in the third quarter. In general, food costs increased by 254.3% in 2015, the figure that easily exceeds wage increases by any measure. The increase in basic food costs impacts the poor in the extreme, and spends much of the income on needs such as general food. However, the numbers of the Central Bank of Venezuela show that the state apparatus carries a heavy burden as a whole. One of the most widely spoken figures is the current account of the bank, which shows a US $782 million deficit for the third quarter of 2015. This is especially because these figures are from a time in 2015 when the average volume of Venezuelan oil surpassed $40/barrel. Today, Venezuelan oil sells for around $25. In other words, the trade deficit figures are probably worse and there is no quick recovery statement. It is important not to forget that this is not the whole picture. First, although the economy has witnessed a serious decline in the whole, the poverty figures do not seem too bad. On the contrary, the latest official statistics suggest that extreme poverty remains relatively lower. The figures show that 4.78% of Venezuelans currently live in extreme poverty, from 4.9% in November 2015 and less than half of that in 1998. This figure shows that the poorest Venezuelan people do not show the peak of the crisis in the rise of food prices. However, since we do not have any new data on purchasing power, the picture is missing. This means that poverty and the working class are uncertain as to how well the Venezuelan people are playing. Most of the Venezuelans, more than 10 years old, have achieved a steady increase in purchasing power for basic goods. However, if inflation continues to rise while wages are trying to keep pace, the purchasing power is wasted and we can finally see that the poverty figures increase. At the moment, at least Chavez's social missions do not just drag the country into extreme poverty. In fact, it seems that poverty is extreme. At such times, this is an important success on its own. Another point worth doing is the state. The Venezuelan government still has innumerable rainy day funds that are set on an edge when it is now facing the country. The Central Bank of Venezuela also stated that since the third quarter of 2015, the country's foreign currency assets are around $35 billion. It is unclear what the government may have been in various funds. This means that the government can save enough to keep it. It is also noted that this view is not shared by many financial analysts. Wherever the default risk remained at once, the report by Barclays in January was the result of a possible presumption until the end of the year. The report suggested that Venezuela could be consumed by its debt obligations of 90% of its 2016 oil income. It suggests that the form of eyebrow enlargement will be used by the government to fund its savings throughout the year. Credit default swap traders also reported that 79% of the probability of a payment missed by the end of the year would be reached. To summarize, the VATs are already turning. An important date will be followed on October 16, when the PDVSA 2016 bond is mature for anyone interested in the default issue. These are the biggest part of Venezuela's international repayment of about $10.5 billion this year. A badly timed political crisis. Now for more bad news. A political resolution to the economic downturn anytime soon seems remote. The National Assembly is firmly in the hands of the right-wing coalition, the Democratic Unity Roundtable (MUD). Meanwhile, President Nicolas Maduro has retained control over the ministries, while the Supreme Court is still aligned with Chavez's mode. Most major public enterprises also remain on the Chavista side of the political divide. The good news is the MUD may have a serious battle on their hands if they try to impose serious neoliberal reform in the coming months. The MUD probably can't succeed in removing President Nicolas Maduro until late in the year, and until then the Supreme Court might block many of the new MUD-dominated National Assembly's most egregious demands. The bad news is Venezuela could now be staring down the barrel of a lengthy political stalemate. Since the right wing took control of the National Assembly in January, neither Maduro nor the MUD have shown much interest in dialogue, let alone present a cohesive roadmap to economic recovery. The danger here is that the political crisis could exacerbate the economic crisis. Saber-rattling abound. Indeed, there are already signs the political stalemate could be hard to break. The MUD sent a clear message they will fight tooth and nail against Chavez's mode on the second day of the new National Assembly. Then they swore in a group of legislators temporarily barred from office over allegations of electoral irregularities. The MUD has since backed down, only to enrage Chavistas by removing a portrait of 19th-century liberation leader Simon Bolivar from the assembly. The MUD's National Assembly head Henry Ramozola justified the removal by arguing the portrait made Bolivar look too dark-skinned, and not sufficiently Caucasian. In short, the MUD doesn't look like it's setting the groundwork for serious negotiations with Maduro. In fact, the MUD itself is yet to present a cohesive economic strategy of its own, with no clear answers on how to ease inflation or boost productivity. This means it remains an open question whether the MUD will opt for the gradual imposition of Greek-style austerity or Russian-style shock therapy. Unfortunately, Maduro has likewise failed to present a clear path out of the crisis. In his State of the Union address on Friday, January 15, the president effectively declared he wanted new decree powers to fix the economy. Unsurprisingly, the MUD has already voted down the decree in the National Assembly. Even if the measure had somehow been approved by legislators, there's no reason to believe it would have done much to improve the economic situation. The proposal would have granted additional funds to social missions, along with suggesting some bureaucratic tinkering such as reinforcing tax evasion measures and shoring up currency controls. While there's nothing wrong with improving the popular social missions, this doesn't constitute a broad-spectrum plan for economic recovery. Cracking down on tax evasion is likewise a great proposal, but not exactly a silver bullet. However, reinforcing existing currency controls can't possibly help. After all, the currency control system is part of the problem. Currency controls and the forex system. If we momentarily turn back to the BCB report, we find even the bank has conceded current economic policies aren't working. The report stated the bank's preliminary estimates find close to 60% of inflation registered in 2015 is the result of foreign exchange incidents associated with the exaggerated depreciation of the Bolivar currency. This means the BCB believe the lion's share of inflation is being caused by currency manipulation. The bank described this as part of an economic war, and this is likely true. Venezuela's private sector has long attacked the socialist government. So much so, that for years Venezuelans have acknowledged that scarcity of basic consumer goods spikes around important elections, as businesses seek to pressure voters into turning against Chavez's mode. In order to combat currency manipulation, Maduro has announced reforms to the exchange system every few months since coming to office in 2013. In a period of 2 years, none of his reforms have had any measurable impact on the currency manipulation crisis. We can debate why the reforms haven't succeeded, but we can't debate the simple fact that they haven't provided the desired results. Currency controls aren't an essential feature of socialism, and there are alternatives for Venezuela. Progressive-leaning economists including Mark Weisbrod from the Center for Economic and Policy Research have repeatedly called for Venezuela to adopt a managed floating exchange rate, and for years it's been hard to disagree. If both Maduro and the MUD sought to negotiate economic reform, the managed float could imaginably be on the table.